So with regard to 9001-2015, where we are at the time that I'm recording this, is the Working Draft 0 was maybe made, maybe not, I don't know, I never saw it, but Working Draft 1 was completed, Committee Draft 1 was completed, Committee Draft 2 was skipped or was probably informal. We then went into the Draft International, the DIS version, that was completed but was originally due in April 2014 and came out in October, so it was pretty late. And by all indications, ISO will probably have to skip the FDIS. There's a little bit of political pressure to make sure that they don't because they don't want to be seen as rushing it, but let's face it, the clock is ticking. So the international standard is going to come out in September 2015, and typically that's only formalities and translations only from the previous version, which in this case would be the DIS. So if you've bought a copy of the DIS, it's a very high likelihood that what you see there is what you're going to get in the released version. And keep in mind that there were really no significant changes from that CD1 early on. So despite all of the complaints and comments, that 10,000 some odd comments between the various versions, nothing really changed since that CD was released, what, a year ago, more than that. So some of the problems that we had was during the CD, 80% of the ISO members did vote, but there remained strong opposition, primarily from the US. And of the countries that accepted the CD, they had many, many comments that needed to be processed, thousands. And again, because of time constraints, that second committee draft may have been skipped entirely. There were a lot of problems with the DIS version. First of all, it was rushed. When they published it publicly, they forgot to remove the watermark. And I had to write to ISO and say, what was this? And they just said, well, we needed to get it out. There was also a meeting in Paris that failed to process all the member feedback from the committee draft because there were so many thousands of comments they couldn't get through them at the meeting. So they gave the remainder to a small handful of people to just process offline. We don't actually know if they were ever processed. Now, they were entered into a spreadsheet, but were they ever considered? Now, it's clear that they weren't because it looks like the DIS is just going to go into the final stages without any kind of edits. So if you're sitting on thousands of changes from the committee draft and then thousands more from the DIS, and there's no actual change to the standard, that probably means you're not really processing the feedback. Not only that, there was not enough time for translation per ISO requirements. Now, normally, in order to move from CD to DIS, you would have a 2-month translation period followed by a 3-month voting period. But in order to maintain that publication date, ISO decided to do those in parallel. So for countries that don't speak English, they had to use the same 3-month period to not only translate the document, but also then review it and provide feedback. This gave unfair advantage to countries that speak English. It may have been a violation of their own rules. Now, most recently, we found out that the DIS did pass with an overwhelming majority of nations. Only 8 countries voted no, including the United States. Interestingly, it also included Canada and Japan, who we could assume may have rejected some of the risk proposals. What is interesting is Australia's not on that list. Again, the major focus was on wordsmithing, not improving content. So by doing an analysis of word count, we can find that 74% of the changes were just a simple rephrasing of existing requirements. In other words, there's no change to requirement, it was just language changes. Of the remainder new material, 20% of that was added because of an Annex SL mandate, not anything that the technical committee came up with on their own. The remainder 6% was actually developed by TC 176. So that means the overwhelming bulk of time was spent just on renumbering paragraphs to comply with Annex SL and to change language on the old requirements, not adding anything new. So this standard does not bring us into the 21st century. It is still just a rephrasing of language that is carried over from the 1950s. If we look again, here what I've done is I've taken the standard and color-coded the changes, and we can see just visually how much of the material, the light green, is just a rephrasing of old requirements. The red, the pink color is the Annex SL content, and those little green paragraphs are the only things that TC 176 dreamed up on their own. They had to take a lot of shortcuts to meet this date. One of the things was that the quality management principles were being developed in parallel with the standard rather than prior to the standard. So normally you would develop your quality management principles first, and they become the bedrock and the marching orders and the foundation for all the work that's going to be done thereafter. However, the standard was already underway being written with the quality management principles not finished, not ratified for a very long period of time. Again, the bulk of the effort was just simply in paragraph shuffling, aligning the existing requirements to the Annex SL paragraph numbers. This didn't leave any time for TC 176 to explore any major new concepts or advances in quality management. They decided that would just leave them for the 2020s. So another generation from now, maybe we'll get some quality management standards and practices that reflect at least the 21st century. And again, as I said, they ran the translation and review stages in parallel to save time, which sort of jeopardized consensus. And, as we said, they'll probably skip the FDIS stage. They left the processing of reviewers' comments to an offline select team members rather than having the full committee look at them. That probably means that the comments are just sort of typed up and put into a Word document, an Excel spreadsheet, but they didn't actually provide any feedback or input into the actual content of the standard. They were just recorded and then ignored. They also received about 550 comments on Annex SL in the last round of commenting. Now those they get to ignore entirely because you really can't change any of the Annex SL text. So in order to save time, we can just put those aside and ignore them. Now another thing is that they claim that they went through an ISO user survey, except they ignored those results entirely, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Next, they had a problem internally with that they wanted to solve, and that's with preventive action. There was a lot of discussion within the TC 176 that they needed to clean up the language of preventive action, which they felt nobody fully understood. They decided that they would come up with an elegant solution. They could combine the problem of preventive action along with the risk mandate of Annex SL into a single solution called risk-based thinking. Now, since then, the ISO leadership, US tagged TC 176 representatives, and some other ISO people have been giving webinars and seminars and writing articles for Quality Digest, and they seem to be repeating a couple talking points that aren't quite true. The first of which is that risk was included because of the user feedback from the ISO survey. Now, this is not true for a couple reasons. First, risk ranked 5th on the list of things that ISO users wanted to be included in the new standard. There were 4 other things ahead of it, all of which were ignored, with the possible exception of knowledge management. But we'll talk about that in a moment. The other thing is that the survey was published over a year after they had already begun work on the initial draft in response to, of course, Annex SL. And if we remember that Annex SL was originally cut and paste from Guide 83, which was begun years before this ISO survey that they're talking about. So no, risk was not included because of user demand to have risk management included in ISO 9001. Untrue. There's also a meme going around that ISO 9001 has always been about risk. I'm just going to say that's not true and leave it at that. Next, there's a lot of talk that ISO 9000 was developed by consensus, and this kind of depends on your definition of consensus. If you think that consensus means a tiny group of people doing what the Technical Management Board said they need to do and then not giving anybody the real right to undo it, then I guess you could call that consensus. I just don't call it that. A lot of people think ISO standards taste like chocolate, but I don't know. I think they're vanilla. So let's talk about this thing called risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking is not based on any known risk management practice or principle. It's not mentioned in any body of knowledge, curriculum, or text on risk management. It's not mentioned by any known quality guru. And it's been denounced by risk professionals, including ISO's own TC 262 members, on risk management. One of them told me a very interesting thing. Risk-based thinking is like selling bottles of sound. There's nothing to it. Another problem is that ISO TMB has forced a view onto Technical Committee 176 that risk can be positive. The idea of positive risk is very controversial, but the thinking is that positive risk or opportunities should be managed in the same way as negative risk. That idea is not shared even universally in the risk management profession. People understand that opportunities may follow one path and risk, being negative, would follow another. It also defies the dictionary. When we say that person is engaging in risky behavior, we don't mean that they're being positive. If I'm flying on a plane and saying, oh man, I'm feeling a lot of risk on this flight today, that's not intended as a positive thing. The word risk is a negative connotation. Here we have everything that Edwards Deming ever said about risk. Now, what's interesting is if you look at ISO 9001 2015 right now, you can see the struggle going on between TC 176 and the ISO Technical Management Board. The first 4 notes under the definition of risk were written from Annex SL written by the TMB. And the first one says, risk is in effect is a deviation from the expected, either positive or negative. Note number 5, however, was added by TC 176, and it says, risk is sometimes used when there is only the possibility of negative consequences. So these guys are fighting right on the printed page. When we look at the actual requirements for risk-based thinking in this ISO 9001 draft, we find that there are no requirements for processes. There are no required procedures. There are no required records. There's no requirement for evidence. And there's specifically no requirement for formal risk management. Now, an earlier draft of the standard actually said that. It said risk-based thinking does not require formal risk management. That language was tempered a little bit in the latest draft, but the intent coming out of TC 176 is that no, risk-based thinking is not formal risk management. And there you have it. The emperor has no clothes. In short, risk-based thinking is air. There is nothing there. It has a greater impact on TC 176 because it presents the first time that TC 176 has invented a requirement out of thin air rather than insert a requirement that was based on established best practices. This means that there's no established evidence that risk-based thinking works because it doesn't exist, and it never has existed. Those people writing books about it and giving training seminars, etc., they're simply pulling it out of thin air just like the authors did because it does not exist. And as a result, the entire world is now the laboratory for TC 176's experiment in risk-based thinking. So we'll know if risk-based thinking works or not only after they publish the standard and people have paid for it and tried to implement it and gotten audited to it. And that's really not fair. So what could possibly go wrong, right? Well, how about this? In 2003, in the United States, we began hemorrhaging certificates. Now, it's probably not a coincidence that 2003 was the 3-year deadline after the last time we did a major change to ISO, which was in 2000. So the standard came out in 2000, and people had a deadline of 2003 to adopt it, and we began hemorrhaging certificates. And between 2003 and 2011 or so, the United States has lost 28,400 certificates. That's a lot. Now, we did see a spike in the last set of numbers, and that spike is being investigated because my sources are telling me that a few of the U.S. registrars may have inflated their numbers artificially to make their businesses look larger, and they provided those numbers to ISO, and ISO doesn't have the wherewithal or the means to really verify. So the numbers in the last ISO survey for the United States are yet to be really validated independently. How do you audit risk-based thinking? If the only requirement is that you think about risk, you don't need records or procedures or evidence or documents, how is that going to be audited? Now in the standard, where does it call out risk-based thinking? Well, it says that you need to think about risks that are related to satisfying the customer requirements. Then there's a little bit of a reference in post-delivery support saying that your level of post-delivery support is going to be determined by reviewing those risks related to product and services. And then it says during management review, you're going to assess those risk actions that you took. And you know what? That's it. That's really the only place that they're invoking this alleged major shift. So let's move on from risk-based thinking to some of the other requirements of the new ISO 9001 standard. The quality principles, as we talked about, remain largely unchanged. We had 8 before, and now we have 7. They are customer focus, leadership, engagement of people, process approach, improvement, evidence-based decision-making, and relationship management. The first thing you'll notice is that system approach has disappeared. They have just maintained the process approach. Now, ISO never had process people on the technical committee, so they've never quite understood the difference between processes and systems, which is very frustrating to me as a guy who's a former process engineer. I understand the difference between process and systems, and TC 176 never got it. And rather than try to figure it out and bring smart people on board to try to come up with something, they just decided to punt, and they did away with system approach entirely. And that's a little bit disappointing. The last quality management principle is relationship management, and it goes beyond just supplier relationships, but also into various other relationships, such as the relationship between you and your wife and that new transvestite doorman at that trendy club in the village. I don't know. No, actually it has to do with not just suppliers, but also the relationship with customers, with regulatory bodies, and other important stakeholders. So it could be pretty cool. If you want to work the transvestite doorman in there, I'm sure you can. The Annex SL clause structure is here, and as we can see, the PDCA model is still intact. We're still planning, doing, checking, and acting. And the kind of neat thing is that if this is a part of Annex SL, then all of the future standards are going to have a PDCA model in it. This is a comparison of the 9001-2015 clauses on the left with your current clauses that you're familiar with in the 2008 version. And as we can see, we've just sort of moved things around to fit into the new numbering structure. Didn't require any major changes. Now, what are some other changes? Well, one that's disturbed me a little bit is this inclusion of something we call human factors. It's not named as such, but it has crept into the standard. Specifically, TC 176 is now requiring an assessment of the social and psychological factors to determine the suitability of the workplace. Good luck with that. Also, TC 176 has inexplicably combined the concepts of documentation and records into a single thing. This confuses where the standard is actually requiring a document versus a record, but it also is going to be confusing for when do you invoke the requirements for document control versus record control, and it's a very, very bad backwards move. A new requirement on change control is probably very, very welcome. There's not a lot of wording in it, but I think it stands to be a very, very good and beneficial requirement, and that it's finally saying that any changes to the quality management system and their processes should be done in a controlled fashion. There's another new clause called organizational knowledge, and it says that companies must both determine and maintain the knowledge necessary for the operation of its processes and to achieve conformity. It then goes on to define knowledge in a way that is impossible to understand as the available collection of information being a justified belief and having a high certainty to be true. If you were to apply the term risk-based thinking to that definition, you would find that it doesn't actually fit. So I'm not happy about this organizational knowledge clause because it's really not clear what they're looking for. One of the best clauses in the new standard is context of the organization, and it requires the organization to understand itself before understanding ISO 9001. For most companies, this will probably be a one-time exercise where the bulk of the work is done initially, and then maybe periodically you maintain it. You make minor tweaks as your company changes. But it's going to require you to understand and determine a few things, including who are the interested parties or the stakeholders that have an impact on the company, but also that you may impact. So that includes customers, but regulators, and even the public, and I think that's important. It then requires you to identify both internal and external issues that could impact or which you could impact. And I think that's also important. And of course, to identify your goals. These then tie into the strategic direction of the organization. And while not a mandatory requirement to have one, because it is mentioned in there, it is a good idea that the company use these various context elements to then tie in with the boss's strategic direction and actually document that so that you can then tie that in with quality objectives, process objectives, etc. So I think this is a very big benefit. However, ISO 9000, because it wasn't a dramatic change, will still have many of the problems that it's had for the last few decades. And the first one, of course, is that it's still very much manufacturing biased. TC 176 has failed in its attempt to try to make a universal generic standard that applies to both manufacturing and service sector. It thinks that by making words generic and ambiguous, that somehow that will apply to both, and it continues to alienate the service sector, and they're just going to continue to move to other standards such as CMMI. Document control, despite everything that TC 176 is saying, and I'm sorry, Dr. Nigel Croft, but you're wrong on this, it is still biased towards companies that use hard copy binders and little red stamps. The fact is when you look at that, if I have a hard copy binder system, I'm going to comply with the rules of ISO 9001 very easily. If I'm using contemporary modern information management systems such as SharePoint or Confluence or Jira or Wikis, any of that, I'm going to have a very hard time complying with the new rules under document control. I believe this is because no one on TC 176 actually understands modern information management. They think that cloud computing is somehow representative of contemporary, when cloud is just, storing documents online, and that doesn't really address all of the new changes in document management. And so we're stuck with an updated wording for requirements that came out of probably the 1950s. It's a very big disappointment. Now, the process approach I thought was slightly more improved in its definition, but I ran it past a couple people who were sort of new to the process approach or who didn't know it as well as I did, and they said they were fairly confused by it. So I'm not sure who to believe. When I look at it, I think that it's slightly better worded, but the people who matter, and people who are looking at this for the first time, said they still didn't understand what the standard was looking for. This removal of preventive action is only going to confuse things further, because companies now are going to say it's no longer required, I'm not going to bother doing it. And I think that that's harmful to companies. There also isn't a clear linkage that risk-based thinking was supposed to replace preventive action. There's a lot of talk about that from TC 176, but when you actually read the standard, the words aren't there on paper. So what's going to happen is companies are going to drop preventive action and return to a day when they only fix things after they break them. That's not good. The other thing I have a problem with, and I'm fairly alone on this, is that these standards still operate from a false assumption that human beings operate under the governance of a single master policy. And I believe that history tells us that we're wrong. Human beings do not operate under single policies. They operate under these massive networks of laws and rules supported by thousands of people in courts and lawyers and police, and a policy doesn't seem to matter much. But ISO still buys into the concept of a policy. The design model remains the same. It hasn't changed in decades, and it's still too rigid. It still applies down to inputs and outputs and verification, validation, reviews, and it's so anti-agile. If you have an agile design process, you're not going to be happy with the new standard. Design of services remains completely unaddressed. So it's still design a product, no matter what they talk about. Service sector is going to have a very hard time figuring out how they design their services according to ISO 9001. As a former process engineer, I'm very frustrated because when we were developing processes, the biggest amount of time, the largest amount of time was always spent on designing the process first. And ISO just begins again with identifier processes as if they already exist. There's no language talking about what do you do to create a process if you have to make a new one. And in some companies, you're making new processes all the time. So I'm a little frustrated that they still do not talk about the design of processes. There still relies on a top-down management by dictate philosophy where employees are not allowed to participate. This is largely due to some politics within TC-176. There are certain corporate interests that do not want to empower employees at all. Any concept of the word worker, for example, is always stripped out of it because I guess they think that mentioning any kind of employee co-participation is tantamount to unionization or communism, and so we can't have that. Despite language to the contrary, it's still really not proposing any kind of mutually beneficial supplier relationships. It still assumes that you're beating your suppliers into submission. And it's very anti-Deming. The other problem I have is that these new elements that they've thrown in are actually career paths. So things like risk management, knowledge management, human factors, these are things you can go to school and study. These are university degrees. You can go for 4, 6, 8 years and learn these things. These are not things that you throw into a standard just willy-nilly and put them in as a few sentences without doing some kind of study of their impact. So you pity the poor quality manager who's going to get assigned all of a sudden all of these things. You have to be a risk manager. You have to understand knowledge management, and you're going to have to be a psychiatrist and a psychologist and a social worker for human factors. This is not ideal. The other problem is that, again, ISO doesn't seem to understand what a process is. And so they go back and forth from different words within the standard in many places where the word process would work very well and therefore invoke all those process approach controls. So they use words like program and business process and activities and arrangements and functions when they really need to decide if in any time they're talking about an activity, do they mean a process that needs to be managed per the process management controls or not, and then stick with one word and use it. But don't worry, it's not all bad. We're going to get to the good part right about now. The first is the immediate benefit. First of all, look, it's not a major change despite what they're saying, and despite all the certification bodies going to be selling upgrades and the consultants, etc. This is not a major change. Some 70% of this thing is no change from the old standard. If you're doing an integrated management system, which, by the way, very few companies are, but if you happen to be one of those guys who's doing it, you're going to find things much, much easier. And that high-level structure should remain pretty fixed for the next 1,000 years.